Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, I want to talk a little bit about head coach Chris Finch's comments after practice on Monday. We talked about the best non-cat five-man lineups on Monday's show, but based on Finch's comments, it doesn't sound like he thinks the offense will change all that much. What will Rudy Gobert's role be with Towns out? And then let's talk about the Western Conference in general and where the Wolves sit in the Western Conference standings and what's been an underwhelming conference so far this season. It's all upcoming on the show. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Today's episode is brought to you by Prize Picks. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with promo code Locked On. That's prizepicks.com, promo code Locked On. Happy Tuesday, everybody. Today I want to talk all things about the catless Wolves. I want to talk Western Conference. It's all coming up on the show. A big thank you here off the top, though, for making Locked On Wolves your first listen each and every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms, including Apple, Google, Spotify, Odyssey, wherever you listen to podcasts, you can find us. You can also watch the show now on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app. That's both on Roku and Amazon Fire TV. More great local sports coverage 24/7 for free. This show, Locked On Vikings, Locked On Wild, Locked On Twins. Winter meetings ongoing this week, so plenty of baseball news, Locked On Golden Gophers. It's all there. Download the Locked On Sports Minnesota app today on Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And of course, as always, you can follow this show on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves. Don't forget the T, and at Beecken with two B's, two E's, C-K-E-N. All right. So I want to start by talking about Rudy Gobert and his role in the Timberwolves offense. So Chris Finch talked to the media after practice on Monday, and I'm going to list a bunch of quotes put out by our friend Dane Moore, of course, host of the fantastic Dane Moore NBA podcast, and going to he essentially transcribed these quotes on Twitter. So I'm going to pull a few quotes from Finch, courtesy of Dane, and I want to start by talking about Gobert. So Chris Finch was asked, again, Dane tweeted this out on Monday, Chris Finch on how Rudy Gobert's role changes with Karl-Anthony Towns out. He says, this is a quote from Finch. I don't think it changes all that much, to be honest with you. We might be able to find him a bit more as a rolling threat, open up some opportunities there, but I don't think it changes drastically. Okay. So I think what he's saying is Gobert himself, we're not going to use him differently within the offense because he doesn't do much else, right? You're not going to post him up. He obviously can't shoot outside of 5 feet. The way you use him offensively is in pick and roll. So I think he's kind of a weird way to interpret that question. In my mind, the question is, so you're just going to run a lot more pick and rolls? And obviously the answer to that is yes. There's no question the Timberwolves are going to run more pick and roll. In fact, D'Angelo Russell talked about that too. Another quote that Dane transcribed, this one from D'Lo, it says, D'Angelo Russell on how the Wolves spacing evolves without Cat. D'Lo says, quote, I think throughout the season before this point, we were working on ball movement, less pick and roll, because the spacing just wasn't there yet. So now with Cat being out, it allows us to flow into more pick and rolls. End quote. Yes, that's essentially what I think Finch was being asked, and he didn't directly answer. The Wolves are obviously going to run more pick and roll. It plays to D'Lo's strengths. I'm not suggesting that D'Lo will be a better player without Karl-Anthony Towns on the floor. But without Towns, and we've talked about this maybe in a different context over the past week since Towns got hurt, not quite a week yet, but the past week or so, things are going to be simplified with no Karl-Anthony Towns, right? The Wolves will run more pick and roll because that's what Rudy's very good at. That's what D'Angelo Russell's very good at. You only have Ant as a true isolation threat. Cat face up on the perimeter is a pretty good offensive play set, right? If you just give Cat the ball, give him some space and say, hey, use your drive to set up your three. We'll figure it out beyond that. I mean, Cat turned into a good enough playmaker, an extremely good driver, and he's obviously a very good three-point shooter, even if the percentage hasn't bore that out so far this season. That's a pretty good offense. And obviously the Wolves were trying to do more than that with Towns on the floor. But now with no Towns, you're just going to run a lot of pick and roll. D'Lo and Rudy, Ant and Rudy. You're going to obviously still run some ant isolations, but I think, that's when you run into some spacing issues with Rudy Gobert, although maybe less so now with no Karl-Anthony Towns as well. But obviously, we're going to see more pick and roll. We're going to see more Rudy Gobert involved in pick and roll. We're going to see a lot more Rudy rolling, getting the catch, and hopefully, some dunks, some lobs from D'Lo. But you're also going to see, we saw glimpses of this the other night. Not the most recent game, but I think going back to the win over Memphis, and then also the loss on was it Saturday? I guess that is the most recent game. The loss to Oklahoma City on Saturday. So weird that they've only played 2 games in the last 6 days. We saw a little bit of this, I think, especially in the Memphis game, where Rudy catches the ball on the roll, and then it's either a short roll where he can turn and swing it to the corner, or it's, as he's rolling to the basket, he catches it and passes to the opposite corner. We saw Towns get pretty good at this last couple of seasons, and he's been involved in less pick and roll of late. But Rudy did a ton of that in Utah. I talked about this a week ago on the show about the essentially Utah's offense under Quinn Snyder with Rudy Gobert as their best player was essentially Rudy plus 4 shooters. And obviously Donovan Mitchell being a dynamic scorer and playmaker as one of those guys, that added a certain element. But it was just surrounded with guys that can shoot threes. And I talked about Bojan Bogdanovic. I didn't get as into his numbers as I intended to the last time I talked about him, so I'll just rattle them off now. Bojan Bogdanovic is a 45% career three-point shooter from the corners, 44.8% this season, by the way, in Detroit, his first year at the Pistons. He's 51.3% from the corners. In his Utah career, in 3 seasons in Utah, he was 44.3% from the corners, and more than a third of his three-point attempts came from the corners in Utah, which, by the way, in Indiana, Washington, and Detroit, where he spent a total of 4 seasons, it was like 25% of his threes came from the corners. That number is way higher in Utah. And also you go back to the beginning of his career in Brooklyn, teams that emphasized the corner 3-point shot and played to his strengths, which Bogdanovic is arguably the best, certainly one of the best corner 3-point shooters in the entire NBA in terms of somebody who does it a lot and does it really well. And Utah just played that up. Kyle Anderson talked about playing out of the corner a lot in San Antonio and how he became more comfortable with it. Obviously, he's shooting the ball well this year from the corners. He's never been really a 3-point threat, but he learned how to do that in San Antonio because that's how San Antonio ran their offense. They did a lot of mid-post, high-post stuff. They needed guys in the corner. And the Wolves are going to need a lot of that with Rudy Gobert and pick and roll. And there's no, and I talked about this a week ago in the context of, hey, Karl-Anthony Towns is a really good corner 3-point shooter. He could be a souped-up version of Bojan Bogdanovic. Well, now with no Cat, you're talking about Taurean Prince would be very good in that role once he gets back and is healthy. Hopefully that's within the next week or so. We don't really know yet, but he's been gone for almost 2 weeks. Kyle Anderson, less dynamic in terms of, being a shooter. You look at the rest of the roster, Jaden McDaniels can play pretty well out of the corner. He shot the ball well from the corner. But the Wolves are going to need to find guys that can spread the floor, can play well out of the corner, both shoot the ball well from 3 and also pump fake and drive, ideally play make, all those things. But that all comes off of the Rudy pick and roll. And so maybe it's an Ant Rudy pick and roll. So you have your dynamic players in the middle of the floor. You have D'Angelo Russell in the corner. And it's probably better served to have Jaden McDaniels in the corner. But depending on how the Wolves space that out and what the sets are that they're getting into, that pick and roll is going to be extremely central to what the Wolves do offensively with no Karl-Anthony Towns. Even if Finch didn't really say that when he was asked, it almost felt like his way of dodging the question, but like, it's obvious. I mean, Rudy Gobert's usage rate is far lower than it's ever been. Going back to when he became a star, his first 3 seasons in the league, he wasn't a high usage player at all, because he was just he was a defensive player. When he became a star back around his 4th season, from that point forward, he always had a usage rate of 16.5% or greater. In fact, he only had 1 season with the usage rate below 16.3. And that was a 16.2% usage rate in the first COVID year with the Jazz. This season, he's only 15.3%. So he's nearly a full percentage point lower in terms of usage rate than his previous career low since he became a star. The Wolves will start using Rudy more. They have to. He's also going to be pretty upset if they don't use him more with Karl-Anthony Towns out. I think it's pretty obvious we're going to see a huge uptick in terms of pick and rolls happening in offense for the Wolves. But what that should also do is then open up some of these simple passes to the corner these simple cuts from the corner, these weak side cuts, maybe that you kick the ball to the opposite corner or you kick it to a weak side cutter. Like there's lots of options that can open this up. And Rudy's a good enough passer that I think that's all pretty feasible. I want to talk a little bit more about some other quotes that Finch had after practice on Monday. And then I want to get into some Western Conference stuff, where the Wolves stand in the Western Conference, why it isn't completely like, hey, this guy is falling necessarily to this point because of the West. So we'll get into all that next year. First, though, today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends over at Prize Picks. On Wednesday night, I would probably take, with the Timberwolves taking on the Pacers, Rudy Gobert. I'd probably take points over, honestly, with no Towns against the Pacers. They've obviously they don't have Domantas Sabonis anymore. They don't play quite as big as they used to. And Towns had a pretty big game against them in the win a couple of weeks ago. I would take Gobert points over against the Pacers. You could also probably take almost any higher usage guard on the Pacers and take anything you want. Assists over, field goals made over, points over, because the Wolves' perimeter defense has been miserable of late. I hope I'm wrong. But anyway, over at Prize Picks, you can pick almost any category, and it's not just points, rebounds, assists. You can also do field goals made. I think steals, turnovers, it's all over there. In terms of props that you can do over at Prize Picks. And you can also cross sports. You pick 2 to 6 players if they'll go more or less, if they'll score more or less than their Prize Picks projection in any of these categories. And you can win up to 25 times your money on any entry. You're not competing against other people. It's just you versus the projections available. And as I mentioned, you can cross sports. So you can do NBA and there's no NFL Wednesday, but you can do NBA and NHL if you wanted to. Or you could cross over on Thursday. You could do a TNT game on Thursday night. Plus the NFL Thursday night game if you wanted to cross sports and link those up. You can make your entries in less than 60 seconds. It really is that easy. Download the app or go to prizepicks.com to sign up and play daily fantasy sports. First-time users can get a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with the promo code Locked On. So, for instance, if you deposit $100, they'll give you $100. If you choose to just deposit $50, Prize Picks will give you $50. Don't forget to enter that promo code Locked On at sign up for an instant deposit match up to $100. Thanks once again for making Locked On Wolves your first listen today. Now for your second listen, go check out the Locked On Sports Today podcast. From the games that matter the most to the biggest stories in sports, go beyond the scoreboard and behind the scenes with local experts and insights that only Locked On can provide. Locked On Sports Today, available on this app, YouTube, and wherever you get your podcasts. Okay, some additional comments from Chris Finch, and it's interesting. I'm going to read these quotes again from Dave Moore, transcribing them on Twitter, and compare that to what we talked about at the show a lot recently. Because it's not rocket science what the issues have been with the Wolves, but Finch is almost saying exactly what I've said on the show, even yesterday for that matter. On Monday's podcast, let's see, I lost my quote that I wanted to. Finch said, Chris Finch on the Wolves' defensive issues on Saturday against OKC. Here's the quote. First and foremost, the transition defense was a total regression back to the beginning of the season. And then in the half court, it was ball containment. Then our low man, when he came over, was zero presence. And then when asked about the point of attack defense and ball containment, Finch said, that's basically the key to all defense. How well can you pressure the ball? How well can you contain the ball? I think some of it is, honestly, if it takes 3 or 4 defensive slides, we'll make 2 or 3. All right. So I just talked about this on Monday on the show. The Wolves transition defense has been abysmal for most of the season. He says it was a regression to back towards the beginning of the season. I don't know that it's ever really been good outside of like the Pacers game. I mean, you could cherry pick a couple games. I think, I don't know. There were a couple games in there where it was decent during that 5-game winning streak, especially. But that's been the number one issue all year. That's the primary reason this team is still middle of the pack defensively and not better. It's because of their transition defense. And obviously, point of attack defense is a major problem. But we've had games recently where D'Angelo Russell's actually been pretty good at the point of attack. He's been fighting through screens. He's been pressuring the ball. He's been diving on the floor for loose balls. He's been doing all those things. Now, it hasn't been consistent, and I guess that's probably the biggest issue. It's almost like there's always somebody who's not holding up their end of the bargain. Oftentimes it's D'Lo, sometimes it's Anthony Edwards. When Jordan McLaughlin was out, we saw more Jalen Noel guarding the point of attack on defense, and he has always struggled to consistently pressure the ball. and to get in a stance and like actually defend. Consistency and continuity in terms of all of these guys being consistent and putting forth the effort at the same time has been the biggest issue. So back to transition defense, though, that is simply, it's a combination of want to and understanding of spacing, of floor balance, right? Um, I have noticed a little bit more attention to detail, like some of the long, defensive rebounding is another thing, but obviously getting a defensive rebound can help lead to a fast break the other way on offense. I've noticed the Wolves doing a better job in terms of their guards rebounding no man's land, between 5-6 feet from the basket and the 3-point line. They've been grabbing more rebounds in that area of the floor. Similarly, there needs to be more effort on the flip side, right? A shot goes up on offense. There has to be some floor balance. If there's somebody contesting and releasing from the opposing offense, the Wolves have to send a couple guys back to defend that. It's just not happening consistently. And I don't know that it's always lack of effort. I think it's just lack of awareness. Sometimes it's lack of effort. Sometimes it's lack of awareness. Sometimes it's both. It's like, hey, I'm too late. I'm just not going to try. And that's not a good look at all. And Finch is absolutely right. I mean, like, that's been a major issue. And the Thunder are one of those teams you can't do that against. They're not a good enough half court offensive team to just play solid in the half court and you should beat them. Play solid in transition and you should beat them. And the Wolves were bad in both areas. And that's how you give up what they give up 135 to a bad team in a regulation game. It's how you give up 142 to Washington a couple nights before. It's just so confounding because 3 out of the last 4 games, the Wolves have given up 135 points or more. None of these are overtime games. You up 137 to Golden State, 142 to the Wizards, and 135 to the Thunder. And then mixed in there was that win over the Grizzlies when they played strong defense. No Karl-Anthony Towns. And they hold the Grizzlies to 101 points, and it should have been under 100. They got a garbage time bucket. And the Wolves have now given up 100 or more points going back to sometime last season in every game. But the defensive effort is just not consistent. And again, back to point of attack defense, D'Lo's been a little better lately. Ant has been okay on the ball, but he just hasn't been better than what we saw last year. And he's been worse off the ball. I talked about this on Monday's show as one of the 3 things the Wolves must improve immediately, specific individual skills that need to improve immediately. And Ant's defensive effort was one of those 3 things. Zach Lowe, for me, has been talked about this before the season, how Ant could be an all defensive team player sooner rather than later. He said even this year was a possibility. And I'm telling you, I talked about this all offseason. Ant's on-ball defense was that good last year towards the end of the season. He wanted to guard John Morant in the playoffs. He wanted the tough assignments. And he's good when he locks in and does them. It's the consistency thing. It's the off-ball defense. It's the attention to detail. It's the want to in transition to get back, to pay attention, to know we have to have floor balance, and to successfully get back defensively, make a play on the ball, defend the rim, all those things. The block rate's down significantly for Ant this year. It all plays together. And the Wolves' point of attack defense and transition defense have been awful. And that's not necessarily Rudy Gobert's fault. They're still the 16th in defensive rating in the league. So they're not miserable. It's just they've been so bad on offense and at times actively bad in transition and point of attack defense. All the other stuff is okay. Finch talked about if they have to make 3 to 4 slides in a possession, they kind of lose contain on the ball. And that's true. At least they're making teams rotate the ball a little bit, which is a step in the right direction because there's been times this year where it was just blow by after blow by. We're seeing a little bit less of that now. It's just, again, consistency. And last year at times we saw it break down simply because the team was playing such a breakneck, blitzing defense that guys would get gassed and they just couldn't keep it up for an entire possession. And then you give up an offensive rebound and you have to get back at it. And this year's team is still giving up offensive rebounds. But this year, they're switching so much that there shouldn't be a lack of stamina in a defensive possession, other than the fact you're giving up a ton of second and third and fourth opportunities to opposing offenses because they're so bad on the defensive glass. But they're not blitzing. They're switching a ton of stuff. They're not even fighting through screens all the time because they're switching so much. So there should be that stamina on that ability to compete defensively for entire possessions. And we're just not seeing that consistently. And it's pretty disappointing. All right. I want to close the show here today by talking about the Western Conference, where the Wolves stand in the standings. And, the Wolves aren't the only disappointing team in the Western Conference, as it turns out. So we're going to do that here next. All right. If I had told you that just over a quarter of the way through the season, the Wolves would be a game under 500, I think you would have been disappointed. We talked about this last week, and like if we're being honest, and you'd said here's the schedule for the first 23 games. I went through and I did this on the show actually the other day. I think I probably would have said that the Wolves would have been 13-10, best case 14-9, and they're 11-12. So that's only 2 games worse than 13-10. So I don't know, grand scheme of things, that's not awful. Now, over the course of the season, you extrapolate that out, that's essentially 7 to 8 games worse, which is significant, right? Like if you think the Wolves are going to win 52 games and they only win 45, that's a pretty disappointing season. But to this point, they're only a couple games behind what you'd expect their pace to be. Now, their point differential is a pretty solidly negative 1.1, which is a little bit worse than you'd expect it to be given their record, because they've had some of these just bad losses. They're currently 11th in the Western Conference. They're only a half game behind Dallas, who's 11-11. I'm not about to argue that, like, oh, well, the Wolves, they're only, like, I'm not going to sit here and talk about how they're 2 games out of the 6th spot. They're almost out of even the play-in, and like, but I think what we can do is we can look at the top of the Western Conference and say, okay, who's overachieving this year? New Orleans. That's about it. The New Orleans Pelicans. I don't think, everyone kind of expected Memphis and Denver to both be right where they are, 14-9. Phoenix, number 1. That's not that surprising. Sacramento's overachieved a little bit. They're 4 over 500, and they've got a strong point differential. It's actually 3rd best in the Western Conference. They've won 3 straight now. They're 13-9. They're 5th in the West. So you'd say New Orleans and Sacramento. Golden State has underachieved a little, although they've kind of straightened things out after a horrific start. What were they, like 0-5 on the road or something at one point? They're still only 2-10 on the road for that matter. Or no, they were worse than 0-5 on the road. They're like 0-7 on the road or something like that. The Clippers, Portland's overachieved a little, but they're still only 13-11, which is only a game and a half ahead of the Wolves. Utah's certainly overachieved, but they've started to come back down to earth after a ridiculously hot start. So, like, I don't know, sitting here right now, the teams ahead of the Wolves that I don't think will be when it's all said and done, it's still Portland and Utah. And, Sacramento, maybe there's some staying power there, but I still think the Wolves end up ahead of Sacramento. New Orleans is, if they have relative health, I think they're going to be. That was one of those teams I said before the season, I didn't know where to put them because it was all based on health. We also didn't see Zion Williamson play with his team as it is now with Brandon Ingram and CJ McCollum. And so, like, as a full group together, so we didn't know what that would look like. But they have the 2nd best point differential in the Western Conference and 2nd best in the entire NBA, behind only Phoenix and Boston. So obviously things have gone extremely well for New Orleans. It's also weird, by the way, we have not seen the Wolves play them yet. And we won't until December 28th. So still another, 3 weeks away, more than 3 weeks away, till the Wolves play at New Orleans between Christmas and New Year's. So sitting here right now, the Wolves are 11th in the West. I think just based on who's ahead of them, I think they'll certainly be in that, 7, 8, 9 range here in the next few weeks, given if just say they keep playing at a 500 level, which is obviously a pretty low bar, but without Karl-Anthony Towns, I think I said this the other day, if they can come back with Towns in early January and be around 500, I think we would all kind of count that as a win. If that's where the Wolves were. And I think that's entirely feasible. The schedule's not insane moving forward. They have Indiana Wednesday and then a road trip at Utah, 2 games at Portland, the Clippers in Oklahoma City. I mean, that's a road trip. Even without Cat, you got to go 3-2 on. You have to win, 2 of the 3, Utah and 2 in Portland. If you can win 2 of those 3, and then, or I guess maybe a better way of saying that is 2 of the 4 with Utah, Portland, and LA, and then win at Oklahoma City. A 3-2 road trip gets you back to 500. You're home for Chicago, 2 against Dallas. Say you go 1-2 on those, you're only a game under 500. You go at Boston, at Miami, at New Orleans, at Milwaukee. That's a really tough road trip. So I guess it gets a bit dicey there at the end of the month. But then it lightens up a little bit at the first part of January. You get a couple against Portland, or excuse me, Detroit. You get Portland mixed in there. You get Houston mixed in there. So by mid-January, if Towns is back, a 500 record's feasible. We'll play this out a little more specifically as we go forward in December. But it all starts with that Indiana game on Wednesday. And that's, a winnable game for Minnesota. Of course, winning at Indiana just 2 weeks ago. And we'll preview that game in its entirety on Wednesday. Indiana's still just a game above 500. They've lost 4 out of 5. But we'll talk more about that on Wednesday's show. So Wednesday, we will preview Wolves Pacers. We'll take a peek ahead after the game on Wednesday night. We will have the live postcast with Marty Gellner of Bally Sports North. That's over at Locked On Sports Minnesota on the YouTube channel. So make sure to subscribe to that channel, watch the live show, and we'll have shows Thursday and Friday as always as well. A big thank you to those of you that do make Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, the show is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. You can also watch the show on Locked On Sports Minnesota. That's the Roku and Amazon Fire TV app. And you can follow the show on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves and at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, C-K-E-N. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. And one final thank you for making us your first listen. And a reminder that for your next listen, you can check out the Locked On Sports Today podcast, the biggest stories of the day, plus instant reactions, big game recaps, and the take of the day. It's available on the Odyssey app, YouTube, and wherever you get podcasts. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.